As a Philadelphia native myself, who grew up in a neighborhood called Fairmount, just a 15-minute drive from Kensington, I've always been aware of the chaotic, corrupt, and confusing history of Philadelphia. And at some point while discussing the history of Kensington with locals, I realized that was the true story that needed coverage. It's obvious to the naked eye that Kensington is horrifying, but few ask the question, how did it get like this? Unlike San Francisco's Tenderloin, which is mainly a result of neglect and progressive policy, Kensington is a story of police corruption, deep-rooted segregation, and now is the face of a blatant scheme by property developers associated with Temple University, who've laid out a 5-year plan to revitalize the Kensington corridor. 6 blocks down the street from the open-air drug market across Lehigh Avenue, developers have already began mass buyouts of property, both residential and commercial, and the police, in turn, are helping them to displace homeless people and push them further up the street toward the open-air drug market. With this in mind, it's quite obvious that the city is allowing the open-air drug market to flourish in order to lower property values and drive out local residents and businesses. That way, they can buy it up at a low cost, then begin enforcing drug laws, push addicts further away, and turn Kensington into a full-blown gentrified corridor, complete with juice bars, yoga studios, and so forth. Sounds crazy, but as you'll learn, for Philadelphia, this is regular. Let's go back to the year 1900. Back then, Philadelphia was a cesspool of rough-and-tumble European immigrants from countries like Ireland, Italy, Germany, and beyond. At this time, Philadelphia was 94.5% white and 72% foreign-born. Imagine that. One of these immigrants was my great-great-grandfather, Jeremiah Callahan, a poor Irish Catholic farm boy from Cork, Ireland. After the Potato Famine, a deliberate genocide staged by the British, Jeremiah hatched a plan to catch a boat to the New World and ended up settling in West Philadelphia in a row home with 7 children and 1 bathroom. Despite overcrowding, Philadelphia became known as the paradise of the skilled worker. Wages were high, and Philadelphia emerged as the center of manufacturing for many industries, but most notably, Kensington was the center of the textile industry, with the Beatty factory, which employed over 100,000 people in 1915. But after World War I kicked off and the Great Depression followed in 1928, Philadelphia experienced what is called de-industrialization, as factories shut down, and for whatever reason, the textile industry moved to the American South. By 1935, Philadelphia lost 2/3 of all manufacturing jobs, leading to mass unemployment and significant urban decay. Many of these European immigrants, who believed that America would be paradise, found themselves jobless and pissed off. Now, simultaneously, 6 million African Americans were leaving the South, heading north to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and of course, Philadelphia. This was called the Great Migration. This migration drastically changed the demographics of Philadelphia. Now, it's important to remember that before this, 91% of African Americans lived in the South. And while slavery was technically abolished in 1865 after the collapse of the Confederacy, the following decades proved to be no less difficult for Southern blacks. The white, formerly slave-holding majority in the South fought viciously against black integration during the Reconstruction era. They formed organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, a vigilante group of terrorists whose foundational goal was to prevent black Americans from voting or achieving political power. And almost all of the initial KKK members were former Confederate soldiers. And in just 2 decades, they assassinated hundreds of politicians and lynched 4,600 civilians. Sharecropping also was running rampant. And Jim Crow laws were militantly enforced by the police, Klan, and just ordinary white citizens. Anyways, black Southerners had a million reasons to leave the South, so they did. However, when they arrived to Philadelphia, they were not in paradise. They found themselves in a very different, but still quite hostile environment, which makes sense given the fact that they immigrated in the midst of an economic decline and were seen as a threat to job security. In 1939, World War II begins, just as black population in Philadelphia hits 11%. Millions of men, both black and white, go to war. Then, in 1945, the war ends and all the troops come home. President Roosevelt signed something into law called the GI Bill, aka the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which provides a wide range of benefits for returning veterans. Most importantly, the GI Bill provided low-cost mortgages and generous financial aid that made it possible for almost every returning veteran to afford a nice, new family home. And so, the idea for suburbia was hatched. It's important to remember that at this point in 1944, suburbia, as we know it today, did not exist. There was no cul-de-sacs, strip malls, or sprawling subdivisions surrounding every major U.S. city. There was only really 2 types of areas, urban and rural centers. And as we know, the urban centers were in very bad shape. So, a real estate developer named William J. Levitt and his company, Levitt & Sons, had an idea.
Use the military method to mass-produce homes on old farmland. That way, he can create new communities overnight.
The mass construction of low-cost, low-density residential developments in the rural areas surrounding the cities, particularly Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. These were called Levitowns and were built very quickly to accommodate veterans returning home from World War II, which was nearly half of all American males. In fact, Levitt & Sons worked directly with the Veterans Administration to subsidize these mortgage payments. Within the first week, 67,000 veterans, both black and white, applied to live in Levittowns.
This is Levittown, Pennsylvania, a new suburban community of 60,000 people, midway between Philadelphia and Trenton, New Jersey.
Yet, 99% of black applicants were denied. Why? It seems pretty unconstitutional, especially given the fact that Levittowns were partnered directly with the VA, but there was nothing the VA could do. Here was the typical experience of a black veteran attempting to apply for a home in Levittown.
I walked up to the salesperson and I said to him, "We're very interested in your house and we'd like an application." And I remember what he said to me. He looked at me, he said, "It's not me, but the management has not as yet decided whether he's going to sell these houses to Negroes or not."
The management he's referring to was the HOLC, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation, who had a plan to dramatically segregate Philadelphia through a practice known as redlining. Now, the HOLC made it imperative that these newly built suburbs and Levittowns were to be whites only.
New middle-class families of Levittown had one other thing in common. They were all white.
And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
In fact, they carved out the entire metro area to confine black people to the north, inner west, and southeast of the city, which were the most neglected parts of Philadelphia. And so, white suburbia was born. My great-grandparents picked up and left West Philadelphia in the early 1950s and never returned back to the big city, as did 150,000 other white Philadelphians over the course of the next 2 decades. Between 1945 and 1970, Philadelphia's white population decreased from 87% to 62%. This mass migration was known as white flight. In an ideal world, it would have just been called flight, but the HOLC's dramatic racial restrictions made this impossible. Anyways, by 1970, Philadelphia was the most predominantly black city on the East Coast and fell into deep poverty as the suburbs expanded. But Kensington, in this context, was a true anomaly because it was one of the few non-segregated neighborhoods in Philadelphia. So the HOLC, who wrote the blueprint for redlining and segregation, designated Kensington in 1945 as a concentration of undesirables, including low-class whites and Negroes. Kensington whites really didn't leave until the 1990s. And throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Kensington was the center of the Irish-American criminal underworld, specifically a gang called the K&A Gang, a group of Irish burglars and methamphetamine traffickers who decided to set up shop on the corner of Kensington and Allegheny. Does that ring a bell? It's the street corner where we filmed the first half of this video. For several decades, this corner flourished as an Irish-controlled meth market, and even back then, police looked the other way. But in the late 80s, crack cocaine was introduced to the inner city.
This form of cocaine comes concentrated. It is smoked rather than sniffed. It produces an intense high within 5 to 10 seconds that last only 5 to 10 minutes,
leading to a spike in homicides and open-air gang warfare that ravaged Philadelphia. As a result, Philadelphia experienced a second white flight. Between 1990 and 2010, white population in Philadelphia decreased from 57% down to 33% of the city, and for the first time, suburban population actually exceeded urban population in Philadelphia. The Kensington whites, including the K&A Gang, were among those whites who left the city in the 90s. This left their open-air drug market pretty much unattended. So crack and heroin traffickers, who were mainly black and Latino, decided to set up shop on the corner once used and occupied by the Irish.
When the 90s hit, a lot of Hispanics and blacks moved into the neighborhood, and that's when the drug trafficking got real heavy.